The Middle East is on a knife's edge. On one edge is a long, protracted war in Gaza, and on the other is a larger, more devastating regional war. If you haven't been following this conflict closely since October 7th, this all might sound like hyperbole. But peeling back the onion reveals just exactly how close we are right now. Let's start from before the attacks on October 7th. What led up to the attacks themselves, and how has Israel responded? How has that response also led to an explosion in tensions in the region? Tensions that have recently exploded and taken us to the brink of a regional war. Before October 7th, 2023, things were relatively calm. Occasional skirmishes would take place every now and again between the IDF and Hamas, the ruling group of the Gaza Strip. Hamas had won the local elections in Gaza in 2005 and had become the de facto political ruling group in the Gaza Strip since then. Israel would classify Hamas as a terrorist group following attacks on its troops. Around this time, Israel would also fight a brief war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, while also balancing widespread protests across the West Bank and Gaza. This was known as the Second Intifada. Things would calm down, and time would pass with relatively minor skirmishes breaking out, with Israel and Hamas exchanging rocket fire. Inside Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu would continue to grow political influence. He would also be faced with growing internal disapproval, with a corruption scandal making its way to the Israeli Supreme Court. However, on October 7th, 2023, things would change forever. Hamas would launch the largest terrorist attack in Israel's history, with thousands of fighters crossing the border, massacring hundreds of Israeli citizens and soldiers along the borderline. Around 250 Israelis would be kidnapped and taken hostage into Gaza, with the bodies of killed Israelis being paraded around the streets. These attacks shocked not only Israel but the rest of the world, and it led to a rally around the flag effect inside of Israel. Israelis began to call for a return of the hostages, but more specifically for revenge. President Biden would urge Israel to consider restraint, despite the fact that it had just faced the worst attacks in its history. From the United States' perspective, having fought decades in ground wars in the Middle East, this just seemed like another run of the same thing. In warning Netanyahu against a ground invasion, Biden wanted to avoid the catastrophic civilian toll that a war in Gaza would have. He also wanted to prevent Israel from being bogged down in a quagmire that Hamas specifically was prepared to exploit. Regardless, Israel would launch its air campaign in Gaza, and a month after the attacks would begin its ground invasion. Israel's goals in this conflict would be to completely dismantle Hamas's fighting capability and establish a new ruling party in Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, in the north, Hezbollah would publicly celebrate the Hamas attacks of October 7th alongside Iran, and would move forces south past the Litani River to the border of Israel. It would also launch rocket attacks on northern Israel. These movements would lead to hundreds of thousands of civilians from both sides of the border fleeing their homes. The invasion would be absolutely devastating for Gaza and the nearly 2 million Palestinians living there. Tens of thousands would be killed, with the infrastructure of Gaza being absolutely decimated. Humanitarian aid would be slowed to a stop by the Israeli blockade, and the IDF would shut off water and electricity. Malnutrition would skyrocket in Gaza, with children being the worst affected. Of course, all of this led to substantial international pressure, with the sympathy from the October 7th attacks rapidly falling away. Pressure would grow on Israel from its allies, with the US calling on Israel to lift the blockade and increase restrictions on its targeting to avoid civilian casualties. Israel would claim that Hamas is stationing its forces, equipment, and leaders alongside civilians, which would make targeting their forces even more complicated. Something which would alleviate this to a degree was the injection of ground troops into Gaza. Instead of relying on air power to target Hamas, which would lead to civilian deaths due to bad intelligence or collateral damage, ground troops could go in and more precisely target Hamas. However, this would lead to other issues. Many of these troops would also conduct themselves incredibly poorly, looting civilian homes and filling themselves acting outside the expectations of a proper professional army. After months of fighting, Hamas would still operate throughout Gaza, and the IDF would be no closer to destroying them. Tensions would continue to grow throughout the region, with Hezbollah and Iran continuing to mobilize forces to pressure Israel. The Houthis in Yemen, part of Iran's axis of resistance, would begin a campaign of targeting civilian ships inside the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the busiest straits in the world. Iranian-backed groups in Iraq and Syria would also continue to target U.S. anti-ISIS coalition forces. All of this would continue to spiral when, in April of 2024, Israel struck the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Iran would vow a direct kinetic response, and fears of a regional war would become even greater as the likelihood increased. Iran would ultimately respond with a massive barrage of ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as drones, fired directly from Iran to Israel. However, thanks to a network of agreements between the US, Israel, and other Middle Eastern partners, this attack was defended and no one in Israel was killed. Israel would respond with a token strike strike on an air defense battery in Iran to save some face. However, war was averted. The war in Gaza, of course, would continue with no end in sight. Tensions would, of course, continue to rise in the north with Hezbollah, with fears growing of another Israeli invasion into Lebanon to push Hezbollah north of the Litani River. This is something that we have discussed in depth in this channel so far, so check those videos out if you'd like some background on that. Negotiations over a ceasefire would also progress. Israel and Hamas would negotiate with the help of the United States, Qatar, and Egypt over the course of months, attempting to return Israeli hostages to Israel and to bring an end to the fighting in Gaza. Since April, Israel and Iran have walked a tightrope. Neither have wanted open war, but neither have easy paths to de-escalate and prevent a war. In late July, a missile strike by Hezbollah on northern Israel killed over 10 Israeli citizens in a soccer field. In response, Israel launched widespread attacks on Hezbollah, with strikes in Beirut killing Fouad Shakur, Hezbollah's chief of staff and third in command. Paired with U.S. strikes on Kataib, Hezbollah, and Iraq, things appeared to be heating up in the region. Then Israel took things into hyperdrive. Israel would target Hamas's political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran during a visit for the new Iranian president's inauguration. This is and was a huge deal for a number of reasons. Being that this strike took place in Tehran, it carried significant political consequences, with Iran raising the red flag of revenge shortly after the Ayatollah ordered a full-scale attack on Israel. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah would state during Haniyeh's funeral that they found themselves in a full-scale fight on multiple fronts. Haniyeh was also the lead negotiator for Hamas in Cairo, discussing a ceasefire and hostage exchange deal with Israel. His death indicates that we may be as far from a peace agreement as ever over this conflict. The nature of Haniyeh's killing is also important to note. New York Times reported that explosions were hidden in the guest house where he was staying in Tehran months ahead of time and detonated while he was staying there. Iran, however, claims he was killed by a spike missile fired from inside Tehran by a hit squad. Neither case looks good on Iran. Either case means that they failed to protect a very important VIP and key ally in the region, and that other visiting allies like, say, Hassan Nasrallah may also be in danger should they visit Tehran on official business. Hamas would replace Haniyeh with their military leader, Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar, someone who's much more hawkish than Haniyeh, would mark a turn from the chances of a ceasefire. Hezbollah would also declare that it would respond to the killing of their third in command and chief of staff following the airstrike in Beirut just days before the killing of Haniyeh. Weeks would pass when the U.S. would scramble to facilitate a ceasefire. Diplomats would meet between Israel, Hamas, the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt. On the table were some key differences, and at stake was potentially staving off a regional war. Egypt and Hamas wanted Israel to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor, a key border crossing between Gaza and Egypt, while Israel wanted to maintain a presence there. Hamas wanted a complete withdrawal of IDF forces from Gaza, while the IDF wanted concessions like a buffer zone and various checkpoints dividing Gaza into 3 partitions. Of course, Israel wanted their hostages back as well. However, Hamas wanted to hold them as ransom for other concessions. Iran and Hezbollah would withhold their respective revenge strikes and not give the image that they were against the peace deal. However, after 2 weeks and no deal, Israel began to see signs that Hezbollah was preparing for a large series of strikes. The IDF, which had previously stated that they would launch preemptive strikes if they believed an attack was imminent, did exactly that. 200 planes would launch a massive strike campaign across Lebanon, hitting ammunition depots, missile launch sites, and other key targets. Hezbollah would manage to get some rockets and drones off, however none of them would reach their intended targets. The IDF would follow up the attacks, saying that they knew Hezbollah strikes were coming, and Hassan Nasrallah would say in a speech that the attack was, in fact, the revenge attack, and that he considered the matter resolved. This would be similar to the April strikes with Iran in that they were repelled, it would make Hezbollah look weak, and the situation would be considered resolved. Meanwhile, Iran had yet to strike. However, reports continue to circulate that their attacks would be soon. To prepare for this, the U.S. would surge dozens of ships to the Middle East, ultimately stationing up to a third of its entire navy in the region, all preparing to defend Israel from the looming attack. As time passed, things continued to heat up between Hezbollah and Israel. Ongoing skirmishes and the building pressure on the Israeli government to reach a solution led to one of the most stunning and effective attacks that I think I've ever seen. Since February, Hezbollah had reportedly switched from cell phones to pagers as their main communications devices. This was due to Israeli tracking of cell phones used by Hezbollah fighters, which led to IDF targeting of those fighters. Pagers, while crude and old, carried a significantly lower signature. Unbeknownst to Hezbollah, though, Israel had drawn them into a massive trap. In mid-September, on one sunny midweek afternoon, thousands of pagers belonging to Hezbollah began to explode. While small, the explosions were large enough to send shrapnel into the carriers themselves, injuring well over 1,000 Hezbollah members, several hundred critically, with a dozen dying. The next day, the attack would continue with even more pagers, as well as handheld radios, public payphones, and other communications devices exploding in a similar fashion. Reporting would later reveal that Israel had infiltrated Hezbollah's supply chain, passing them pagers and other communications devices that had small amounts of explosive residue inside of them. Once an error message was passed to the pager and the user interacted with the device to clear the message, the battery began to overheat, igniting the explosive residue and detonating the device. Simultaneous to these attacks, the IDF would move additional forces to the northern border with Lebanon. Hezbollah's Hassan Nasrallah would continue a series of speeches reacting to the attack, calling them an act of war and declaring a firm response. Other members of the Axis of Resistance would claim that they were moving fighters to the Golan Heights bordering Syria and Israel. Here, they claimed that these fighters would be prepared to fight a ground war against the IDF. However, that said, that may just be bluster. Israeli attacks throughout Lebanon continued as Hezbollah rallied for more intense fighting, and the whole time Iran continued to do nothing. Iran still has not reacted, at least officially, to the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, and they are not doing anything to protect Hezbollah so far. The denial of communications platforms ultimately forced Hezbollah leadership to meet in person, which led to an Israeli strike in Beirut targeting the leadership of Hezbollah's elite Radwan unit. Not only did this include one of Hezbollah's top military commanders and top in the entire chain of command under Nasrallah, it also included his key staff and other commanders. This would lead to days of intense airstrikes across Lebanon by Israel. These airstrikes would target more ammunition caches and key leadership, with Hezbollah suffering some of the worst days in its history. And again, even while these strikes took place, Iran just watched. Their crown jewel, the strongest proxy in the axis of resistance, is actively being decimated from the air, and neither Iran nor Hezbollah has been able to stop the campaign. This is pretty shocking. Mind you, in past videos, whenever we've talked about Hezbollah, I've mentioned that Hezbollah could be considered a peer to the IDF. I mean, they are very strong. They've got reportedly over 100,000 fighters. So thus far, I mean, with the ground invasion still yet to occur, this pretty lopsided attack on Hezbollah has really been a pretty big surprise. That Hezbollah can't really do anything to stop these attacks, and yet they're suffering a pretty significant degree of attrition, that's pretty notable. However, that being said, the ground invasion appears pretty imminent. Iran now finds themselves in a very difficult position. They can respond and risk a larger regional war that they've attempted to avoid to this point. Or they can just not intervene and risk losing not only their crown jewel in their decades-long project at power projection, and risk the anger of other proxies who may feel like they'll be left out to dry as well. Israel, on the other hand, has to balance the risks here. Yes, they need to push Hezbollah back north of the Litani River, and this is something that will inevitably become costly once they transition into the ground offensive. Hezbollah still has a lot of fighters, a lot of anti-tank capabilities, and a large underground network that can protect its forces and its munitions and give it the ability to travel around without being targeted. While Israel is combating this in Lebanon, they'll have to be prepared to fight additional axes of resistance forces on the Golan Heights if those forces do appear. Those forces may even include Iran itself if Iran does choose to engage. However, the faster Israel gets this job done, the faster they'll be able to stabilize the situation. And this is where we are today. Israel is transitioning to a new phase of the war where they're not only fighting in Gaza, they're fighting in Lebanon. And they're taking on the crown jewel of Iran's axis of resistance. At risk is a larger regional war if they aren't careful. However, there's really no good way forward for Israel here. They have to move forward and they have to secure northern Israel from Hezbollah attacks. This ultimately led to airstrikes in Beirut targeting Hassan Nasrallah and the remaining elements of the Hezbollah senior leadership. These airstrikes were successful in killing Hassan Nasrallah and the senior leadership, and at this point of recording, that's the 28th of September 2024, there is only one individual remaining in the senior leadership of Hezbollah. This is an absolute shock, and this is something that I'm really just going to wait till next week to create a full video discussing this because of how absolutely seismic this is. I don't have enough time to really get into those details this week because I'm trying to get this video out, and this all is happening right as I try to publish. So I'm just noting that for the context of this because now all eyes are on Iran to see how they respond, now more than ever. So with all that, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Of course, this is a very complicated issue, and it's also continuing to update. I'm posting this video now, but for all I know, I mean, the minute I post this video, it will already be just slightly outdated with a couple of events happening. So definitely stay tuned for future videos. I'll be posting those on this channel channel and subscribe for that. But like this video if you found this helpful or informative and to help this channel reach new audiences. With all that, I'll see y'all next time. Later.